You know, usually when we talk about a phenomenon like highway hypnosis,
Oh, yeah, that classic feeling.
right, that feeling when you're just like driving your car and suddenly you pull into your driveway with absolutely zero memory of the last 5 miles.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always this expectation of a simple uh, neurological explanation.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Like the brain just switches to autopilot.
Yeah, the visual cortex just stops recording mundane data, and some scientist somewhere points to a chart and says, there it is, routine habituation.
Well, yeah, it's treated as a purely binary mechanism. Like the brain is either actively recording the commute or it's temporarily hitting the pause button just to conserve energy. It's a very clean, very mechanistic way of looking at the mind.
Awake or asleep, engaged or, totally zoned out.
Exactly.
But for anyone who has spent time looking into esoteric psychology or the deeper mechanics of consciousness, that neat little neurological chart feels incredibly reductive.
Oh, absolutely. It's way too simple.
We're looking at a landscape of the mind that is far more fluid. So the question isn't whether your brain just shut down, but rather, what if your consciousness just packed a bag and went somewhere else entirely?
Which drops us right into some beautifully muddy diagnostic waters, honestly.
It really does.
The idea that the physical body is like driving the car, navigating traffic, while the inner self is out taking a stroll through a completely different layer of reality. I mean, it fundamentally challenges the assumption that our awareness is strictly tethered to our physical location.
Exactly. And that is exactly the terrain we are exploring today. We are setting a really relaxed, chilling, and, hopefully humorous vibe for this conversation.
Definitely.
So I invite you, the listener, to grab a cozy beverage, maybe a hot coffee, a calming chamomile tea, or whatever helps you kick back as we explore the hidden architecture of your own mind.
Sounds perfect.
Now, before we get too deep into the weeds here, I need to state exactly this. This podcast will be distributed free of charge on all major platforms for educational purposes.
And the text we are using to guide this exploration today is a profoundly fascinating piece of esoteric literature.
It really, really is.
Yeah.
We are looking at session 327 of the Early Sessions, Book 7 of the Seth material. And the date of record for this specific session is March 20th, 1967.
1967, wow.
Yeah. And we want to heavily credit the Seth material and the publisher, New Awareness Network, for preserving these insights. For those familiar with the framework, this material was spoken by Jane Roberts.
Who channeled the entity known as Seth, right?
Exactly. While her husband, Robert Butts, meticulously kept the notes and recordings.
What makes this specific 1967 session so compelling is how it challenges our baseline assumptions about thought and location.
Oh, big time.
We're really looking at the mechanics of how consciousness projects across time and space, even during mundane tasks, and, how our everyday thoughts act as literal construction materials for our physical environment.
Which is wild to think about. So getting right into the mechanics of these psychic commutes, Seth starts the session by picking up a discussion from a previous night.
Right.
He categorizes different types of extrasensory perceptions based on whether or not they require actual projection. He draws a very specific line between telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition.
And it's a crucial distinction, I think, that often gets blurred in broader esoteric discussions. Like the text states, let me quote this, clairvoyance usually involves projection to some extent. Telepathy may or may not, according to the circumstances.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And then he says, precognition requires projection, though here, as with clairvoyance, the projection itself may not be remembered.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. So if we look at telepathy, it functions more like sending a mental text message.
A mental text message. I like that.
Right. The information moves between two stationed points. Like, I don't necessarily have to leave my physical orientation to ping your consciousness.
Yeah, you stay put.
But clairvoyance, seeing something happening at a distance, that requires actual projection.
Right. It implies that a portion of your perceptive faculty is actually traveling to the location of the event. I mean, it's a literal movement of a portion of the self, not just, passively receiving a signal.
Now, I usually think of clairvoyance almost like strapping on a VR headset.
Oh, interesting analogy.
You are physically sitting in your living room, but your senses are completely immersed in another location.
Yeah.
But does that analogy actually hold up here? Or is Seth arguing for something more displaced? Like, what if my mental Wi-Fi drops during a projection?
That's a funny way to put it. But, well, the VR headset analogy works for the visual immersion aspect for sure,
Yeah.
but it falls short mechanically. Because with VR, you're simply receiving data fed into a screen in front of your eyes. You haven't actually gone anywhere.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, Seth is arguing for genuine displacement. Your inner perceptive faculties, like an actual fragment of your identity, have literally relocated to gather that data.
Wow. Okay, and then there is precognition, seeing the future. The text says precognition absolutely requires projection, but you might not remember it.
Exactly.
So your inner self is basically traveling along a probable timeline to see an event, but by the time you snap back to normal waking consciousness, the memory of the trip is just wiped clean.
Which honestly makes perfect sense.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because if you consciously remembered every single projection you made into the future or the past, it would be catastrophically disorienting to your present functioning.
It would be totally impossible to navigate the present moment. I mean, the waking consciousness is fiercely protective of its current timeline.
Yeah, it has to be.
Right. And the text makes it clear that the connection isn't severed. Rather, the memory of the connection is deliberately suppressed by the ego to maintain physical focus.
So it's a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. You can't successfully process the sensory data of 1967 if your inner self is, consciously flooding your brain with a vivid firsthand experience of the year 2050.
That would be so overwhelming. And that leads perfectly into how Seth describes the dynamic of channeling itself, which is kind of the ultimate example of this projection mechanism.
Right, the mechanics between Seth and Jane.
Yeah, he talks about the relationship between himself and Ruburt, which, again, is the name Seth uses to refer to Jane Roberts. He says, our sessions involve projection, although the extent varies. The projection takes place on both Rubert's part and my own, and represents a psychic displacement of a kind.
Psychic displacement is such a fascinating term. I mean, it borrows heavily from the language of physics.
How so?
Well, two objects cannot occupy the exact same space at the exact same time without displacement occurring, right?
Right. Like dropping a dense weight into a full bathtub. The water has to spill over the sides to make room.
Yes, perfect analogy.
Well,
So in this case, for Seth's personality to project into the physical space and use Jane's vocal cords, Jane's consciousness, Rupert's inner self, has to project outward to make room.
wow.
They are effectively passing each other in the psychic hallway.
That is such a wild visual. And the text actually explores the nuances of that hallway, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It mentions that sometimes their separate personalities sort of merge, forming a composite consciousness.
Right.
But other times, Ruburt is projecting so completely that his personality is relatively absent, and Seth's projection into his place is, quote, relatively complete.
It really raises the question of what happens during the in-between moments.
Yeah.
If you are tuning an old radio, there's that static between stations where you hear two broadcasts overlapping at once.
Oh, absolutely. And Seth addresses this. He notes distortions occur at transitionary points or at points of imbalances. There is a meshing then of data from various levels.
The meshing of data is where things get truly strange.
Yeah.
And what I love is that Seth doesn't just leave this as an explanation for extreme esoteric phenomena like channeling.
No, he brings it right down to earth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He brings this entire concept right down to our everyday, mundane experience. He says, a projection obviously need not be conscious. The waking self may be engaged in normal activities, while the inner self is someplace else entirely.
Which brings us right back to our highway hypnosis.
Yes. Or just simply standing at the sink doing the laundry.
Yay.
The physical body is fully engaged in the thermodynamics of hot water and soap, but the inner self could be wandering through a dreamscape, visiting a friend, or exploring a probable reality.
And the text asserts that there are far more of these brief periods of forgetfulness than we realize. I mean, during these micro moments, projections have often occurred. We just tend to view our consciousness as this unified, solid point locked behind our eyes.
We act like a single proprietor running a tiny little shop.
Yeah.
But this material suggests we are actually operating a massive multi-department corporation.
I love that.
The CEO, the waking ego, is in the boardroom focused entirely on the physical environment. Meanwhile, the shipping department is out making deliveries across town, the R&D department is off exploring future probabilities, and the CEO is completely oblivious to all of it.
Because the waking consciousness is highly focused, but its bandwidth is incredibly narrow. It actively filters out the activities of the other departments just to maintain operational stability.
So the obvious question then is, how does the CEO figure out what the rest of the company is doing without actually leaving the boardroom.
That's the trick, isn't it?
Right. If our inner self is out partying or exploring while we are awake doing laundry, how do we catch it in the act? According to the text, this is considerably more difficult than catching a dream projection.
It is significantly harder because you're dealing with the waking consciousness in its normally dominant condition. Your ego is designed to be the absolute loudest voice in the room.
Oh, for sure.
It constantly demands your attention, pointing at the physical world like the traffic light turning red, the email notification pinging, the physical task at hand.
So to bypass that, without just falling asleep, requires a very delicate psychological maneuver. Because if you fall asleep, you've missed the waking projection entirely and just slipped into a standard dream state.
Yeah.
You kind of defeat the purpose.
Yeah, exactly.
Seth's instructions here are beautifully specific. He says, you must allow the normal waking consciousness to become transparent, so to speak, without, however, disturbing its flow.
Transparent without disturbing its flow. That is, wow. It requires you to observe your waking life, your thoughts, your actions, your physical environment, without attaching to it.
So what does this all mean? I'm supposed to watch the movie of my life playing out while simultaneously staring at the blank screen behind the movie without crossing my eyes. That sounds like a fast track to a migraine.
It does sound like mental gymnastics, but the text explains that you have to look beneath the surface. It states, quote, "For directly beneath the thoughts and impressions of waking consciousness, you will glimpse dream images like those that appear just as you fall to sleep."
Ah, right, the hypnagogic state.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Those weird, fleeting geometric shapes, the random faces, the snippets of nonsensical conversation you hear right before you drift off. Most people who are familiar with meditation or esoteric practices know exactly what those images feel like.
And what Seth is pointing out is that those images don't just exist on the border of sleep. They are playing constantly on a loop beneath your waking thoughts all day long.
Wait, really? All day?
All day. But the glare of the waking world is just too bright. It's like trying to see the stars at noon. The stars are still there. The sun is just overpowering them.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to put it. So we have to make the sun, the waking, ego transparent to see the stars. But the moment you notice those dream images, there's a massive temptation to analyze them.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you see a purple elephant floating across your inner vision, and the ego immediately jumps in to ask, why am I seeing a purple elephant?
And the moment the ego asks that question, the projection is lost.
It's gone.
Yep. The text explicitly warns that these images must be allowed their motion and should not be hampered. If you grab onto them, the waking consciousness just reasserts dominance. You have to remain a completely passive observer.
And if you can somehow manage that passivity, Seth says you drop to the next layer. He says, beneath these, however, you will sense either light or darkness, images of light or darkness, and these will lead to the projection conditions or environment.
It's like a descent.
Yeah, you move past the waking thoughts, past the surface-level dream symbols, through abstract light and dark, until you hit the actual environment where your inner self is currently operating.
But this introduces a really profound philosophical paradox, and Seth addresses it directly. He says, obviously, the self that engages upon this study is not the waking normal consciousness, which becomes instead part of that which is studied, so another portion of the self is brought into activity.
Okay, hold on. If the waking consciousness is the thing being made transparent and is the thing being watched, who is doing the watching?
Right. You are stepping into the perspective of what Seth calls the watching self.
The watching self.
Yeah. He describes it as catching the ordinary waking consciousness unaware. Quote, another portion of the self catches it unaware, leaves no ripple upon its surface, and looks beneath it to other layers of reality. You are watching the self in motion.
It is the ultimate form of self-supervision.
It really is.
You are hovering above the car, watching yourself steer the wheel, while simultaneously looking through the roofs into the driver's mind, and also seeing where your inner self is traveling in some other dimension.
And by attempting this exercise, you are actively expanding the boundaries of your identity. Seth notes that this watching self is aware of both conscious and subconscious motivations. He says, in other words, you are already magnifying the limitations of the self and extending them.
I appreciate that phrasing so much. We usually treat limitations as, rigid, impenetrable walls.
Right, like hard stops.
Yeah. But here, they are just the current, flexible boundaries of our awareness. If we magnify them, we can actually see the gaps. We can step through them.
The text follows up with a really beautiful summary of this expansion. It says, the whole self is being expanded, is beginning to know itself, for it always was what it will appear to be. Yet until it realizes this, its existence cannot be valid completely in terms of self-knowledge or realization.
It always was what it will appear to be. That's profound. You aren't building a new skill from scratch. You are just waking up to a multidimensional reality that has been functioning since the day you were born.
Exactly.
Your inner self is already doing this. You are literally just trying to catch it in the act.
But the danger lies in ignorance, because as Seth points out, if you believe you are only a physical body locked in a single time and space, those limitations become practically valid.
They become your reality.
Yes. Your reality will conform to your beliefs, even if your inner self is constantly operating outside those bounds.
And realizing how you operate outside those bounds becomes urgently important when we look at the next major concept in this session. Because this expansion isn't just about fun psychic sightseeing, it's about understanding what your everyday thoughts are actually doing to the physical world around you.
This is perhaps the most paradigm-shifting concept in the entire text, I think.
I agree.
It fundamentally challenges the psychological model of what a thought actually is.
Right, because we are taught that thoughts are entirely internal private events. They are just electrical impulses in the brain. If I sit on my couch and think about a cup of coffee, the only place that coffee exists is in my imagination. It has absolutely no physical bearing on the room.
That is the standard view, yes. But Seth completely obliterates that model.
He really does.
He states, in one respect, and in quite a legitimate and objective manner, all thoughts are also projections. They leave you in an objective, actual manner and exert an objective effect. They are a part of your psychic identity projected outward, yet you do not feel any loss, nor are you aware of what happens to these thoughts.
They leave you in an objective, actual manner. So when I think about that cup of coffee, a psychic fragment of my identity, encoded with the energy of that thought, actually ejects from my body and enters the physical space of the room.
Yes.
It is not just an echo inside my skull. It is a created thing sent out into the world.
It is a psychological reality that takes on its own psychic mass. And the text provides a very logical reason for why this must happen. Seth explains, you could not retain simultaneously all and exert all the thoughts of your lifetime thus far in any normally conscious way. To do so would be psychological suicide.
Here's where it gets really interesting, makes terrifying sense. The brain is basically a factory running 24/7, churning out thoughts.
Right.
If you never exported those goods, if every worry, every daydream, every grocery list, every song lyric just stacked up inside your consciousness, fully active and pressurized, the factory would literally explode. You have to export the thoughts to survive.
It's a completely necessary mechanism of psychological release. However, the critical question is what happens to those products once they leave the loading dock?
Right, because if I am just exporting mental junk-like anxiety about my mortgage or petty arguments I'm having in my head with a coworker, where does it go?
Seth states unequivocally, the thoughts themselves, also psychic realities, were projected outward, changing and affecting the physical environment in direct and objective terms.
Wow.
He continues, they acted independently of you after their projection. Nevertheless, they changed your environment. Indeed, they formed the environment.
Indeed, they form the environment.
Yeah.
It's not just that my thoughts subtly color how I perceive the room. The text is literally saying my thoughts act as the construction materials that build the physical environment.
Yes. The physical world is not a static stage that you just happen to be standing on. It is the accumulated manifestation of all of these projected thoughts. You are constantly exuding the materials that construct your reality.
That is wow.
And notice the specific phrasing Seth uses.
Yeah.
They acted independently of you after their projection.
That is the part that really demands a pause. Once the thought leaves the factory, it has its own battery pack. It is a fragment of my identity, but it is no longer under my direct conscious control. If I project a highly charged thought of fear, that fear fragment goes out into the environment and starts acting independently to shape the physical circumstances to match its frequency.
It seeks out corresponding energies to solidify its own existence. The text actually elaborates on this hierarchy of projection. It says, various levels of consciousness are projected from the self in much the same manner. They're united, however, as interior and subsidiary identities that are a part of your own, and they're sent out by the inner self for various reasons.
So there is a spectrum here. A fleeting thought about what to have for dinner might be a very weak, unstructured fragment that dissipates pretty quickly.
Right, it doesn't have much mass.
But a deeply held, intensely emotional belief, like a profound ambition or a deep-seated phobia, that becomes what Seth calls a structured, personalized identity.
Exactly. It's a sort of subpersonality that lives in your psychic environment, constantly working behind the scenes to build physical events that align with its core directive. It is dependent on the whole self for its existence, but it operates semi-autonomously.
It's like sending out employees to do your bidding, but you completely forgot you hired them.
That's hilarious, but so true.
And then you look around your life, see a chaotic environment, and wonder why everything is so difficult. Meanwhile, your inner CEO has been exporting chaotic thought fragments for years, and they are just out there diligently building the chaos you ordered.
They're just doing their jobs, and it forces a radical level of personal responsibility, doesn't it? If your thoughts objectively form your environment, then every moment of waking consciousness is an act of creation. You are the architect.
Which ties beautifully back into why making the waking consciousness transparent is so vital. If you can become that watching self, you can actually monitor the factory floor.
Yes, you can see what you're making.
You can intercept the junk before it hits the loading dock and builds a junk reality.
The observation alters the output. And, what makes this particular session of the Seth material so unique is that Seth doesn't just leave this as abstract theory. He actually provides a fascinating real-time demonstration of this projection.
Yes. Right at the end of this incredibly dense philosophical lecture about the architecture of reality, the tone of the transcript abruptly shifts. Seth just pauses and says, "Now give us a moment, please."
Yeah, the transcript notes a pause, and then Seth delivers a piece of spontaneous clairvoyant information. He says, there is a circumstance happening in another place that will concern you both.
It is a wild pivot. We go from the abstract nature of the self to a random, highly specific mystery dropping right into the room. Let me pull up the specific details Seth listed because it's a fascinating rundown.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so he says there's a circumstance happening to the south of their location. Papers are involved. There's an S and a scribbled note. He references an old date, the late 1800s, specifically 1876 or 1886.
Very specific.
Very. He mentions a box containing private papers and legalities. And finally, the death of a male seems involved, perhaps the death of Jane's sister-in-law's father. Nothing like a random 19th century legal thriller dropping right at the end of a cosmic lecture to keep things chilling and fun.
It really is a masterclass in experiential teaching, because while Seth was utilizing Jane's waking consciousness and vocal cords to deliver the lecture, another portion of her inner self was simultaneously projecting southward.
Just casually commuting to another location.
Right, sifting through a physical environment containing a box of old papers and relaying that specific data back through the meshing of their personalities.
Seth ties it right back to the lesson, closing the session by saying, the last data did involve now a projection of a kind, you see. And the most illuminating part of this demonstration is the note Ruburt added at the very end of the transcript regarding Jane's physical experience of the event.
Yeah, that note is crucial. Jane reported that with that specific material, she had a feeling almost like a ray out in a southern direction.
A ray out.
Yeah. She felt a strong concentration being sent out, but she didn't feel that she had completely left her body.
That perfectly encapsulates the concept we've been unpacking. Her physical body remained in the chair. Her waking consciousness remained tethered to the room. But a ray of her perceptive energy, a fragment of herself, elongated and stretched southward to gather data.
It proves that projection isn't always this dramatic, full sensory, floating near the ceiling, out-of-body experience. I think people get really hung up on that.
Oh, definitely. They expect astral fireworks.
Right. But often it is just a subtle, concentrated way out of awareness. You stretch your inner perception to a different location, gather the necessary data, and snap back.
And throughout the entire session, the transcript notes that Jane's eyes had opened often, her speaking pace was average, and her voice was relatively normal. She wasn't in some deep catatonic trance.
No, she was very present.
Her waking consciousness was relatively intact, just transparent enough to allow the projection data from Seth and from the Southern Vision to flow through without disruption.
It is the perfect real-time application of the entire thesis. She made her consciousness transparent, observed the flow of data without letting her ego hamper it, and allowed the projection environment to be articulated. It shows us that these abilities are not supernatural.
Right, they're totally natural.
They are entirely natural, mechanical extensions of the human psychological framework.
We're all doing this. We're all sending out rays of concentration, sending out fragments of thought, constantly interacting with layers of reality that the waking ego completely ignores while it focuses on driving the car or doing the dishes.
It completely reframes our entire understanding of what it means to be present. You are always present in multiple environments simultaneously.
Okay, my mind is completely full. I mean, we have traveled from the kitchen sink to the deepest layers of the psyche, and from the thought factory of the brain to a mysterious box of legal papers in 1876.
It has been a really profound exploration. The source material is incredibly rich and dense with implications for how we live our daily lives.
It really is. So to recap our journey today, you are not a single isolated point of consciousness locked behind your eyes. You are a multi-layered projector. Your inner self is constantly taking psychic commutes, checking out other timelines, and gathering data from other environments while your physical body runs on autopilot.
And crucially, the thoughts you have while on autopilot are not harmless internal echoes. They are objective, psychic fragments that leave your mind and act independently to construct the physical environment you experience. You are the architect, and your thoughts are the literal bricks.
If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, we highly encourage you to study the Seth material books directly. There is so much more depth, nuance, and practical application to explore in the original texts. Please visit the New Awareness Network website and bookstore at sethcenter.com/early sessions. That's sethcenter.com/early sessions.
Reading the transcripts in their original, unedited form offers an experience and an energetic transmission that a summary simply cannot capture.
Absolutely. So we started this deep dive talking about highway hypnosis, that feeling of arriving in your driveway with no memory of the commute, and we wondered where your mind went. Now, armed with the knowledge of Section 327, we have to ask a much bigger, a much more provocative question.
Oh, what is that question?
If your thoughts act independently to literally build your physical environment, what kind of invisible, bizarre architecture did you just construct with that totally random, fleeting thought you had 5 minutes ago? Be careful what you export from the factory. Have a great day, everyone. Keep watching the self.